Morning, everyone. Very good morning. A very wet and windy day outside of London here. And really pleased to be doing this session with you guys. And I'd love to know where you're dialing in from. So do please share in the chat. Do let us know, connect with one another, perhaps share LinkedIn profiles if you're happy to. Hopefully you've all got a tea and coffee in hand. A great way to start the day with an insightful session. So if you've got any questions, do please put them in the chat. We'll pick up with these at the end of the session. Hopefully we'll have time to go through those. So yeah, do share where you are coming in from, where you're dialing in from. And it's really great to see you all. Okay, so I'm very pleased to introduce David Wilson. David is the founder and CEO of Fosway Group, a major commentator in the HR talent and learning industry. So he's going to share some latest research in our session now, Beyond the Noise of AI, the future of learning in an AI world. So welcome, David. Over to you. Lovely to see you this morning.
Lovely to see you too, and hello to everybody from me as well. From a fairly wet and windy Cotswolds, so it's looking very autumnal outside. So yes, good morning to everybody. What I'm going to try and do today is to talk through some of our latest research that we've been doing as part of a massive program over the last 12 months or so, and running forward over the next 12 months around what's going on, the reality around AI. And we're running this across all our segments, across HR, talent and learning. We've published a little bit of this in the summer. Some of the trends research I'm going to share with you in a second. We haven't yet actually published. We did use some interim data at earlier in the year, but hopefully it should be available in the next couple of weeks or so. So hopefully you'll enjoy that. There's lots of charts, by all means, obviously screenshots or whatever, but we got, if you do want a copy of the slides, we'll try and make sure they're available through the Fosway site or through social afterwards. So if I crack on in terms of things, so I think most of you will probably know who Fosway are, but we're an industry analyst, so we've been researching, tracking the market around HR talent and learning for the last nearly 30 years. And we've really very focused around what we would call that next gen thing. So where is it going, rather than necessarily where has it been? But obviously when you're doing that for 30 years, you've also tracked where it's been as well by definition. We publish the Fosway 9 grids, which many of you will have seen around learning systems and digital learning, and also of course into HR and talent. And we work a lot with a lot of corporate organizations to understand what they're really doing. So this is all the research I'm going to talk about. Some of this has come directly, obviously, from corporates. Others has come from now some of our vendor interactions and so on. We also have a strategic research partnership with Close to Still and Learning Technologies. So the data I'm going to talk about, the digital learning realities data in a second, actually comes from that relationship and will be also available as some infographics through that channel as well, back to you as well. So but hopefully that should be published, I'm thinking, in the next 2 or 3 weeks, but we've got to still confirm that. So let me crack on and really talk about what I'm going to try and cover off today. First of all, just a couple of slides around context. It's always useful, I think, to anchor whatever you're talking about in any topic back to what's really going on in the wider business. Where is L&D focusing more generally, and so on, and then obviously exploring the topic. So I'm a big believer in that. I'm then going to really focus around some of our realities trends research around how AI is impacting L&D teams and what their priorities are. And in particular, trying to think about, how fast is this transition really happening? We've probably run 20 plus roundtables, maybe 30 in the last 12 plus months around AI. And we can pretty much fill any one we run, including actually, of course, at Learning Technologies in London. We ran some there. And, a lot of the organizations, I still think, however fast this is coming at us, however much it dominates all the vendor roadmaps, many corporates are still at very early stages in terms of understanding both what AI is capable of doing, but also more particularly where they're going to adopt it in their organization. The other thing I want to focus on, I'm going to flip the lens around and really focus on the vendor side. So I'm sure some of you were at Learning Technologies in London or in Paris or wherever. You know, what the thing you notice now is every vendor is now an AI vendor, seemingly. You know, every vendor is now not just has an AI capability, but they're an AI powered or AI first or whatever it's going to be. And it absolutely dominates the vendor roadmap story. And there's a kind of tsunami of noise around what's really going on. What's going on, and it's really, really hard from a corporate point of view to tell the difference, right? So there are clearly within that companies that are AI leaders, that they have been doing it for longer, that they have a much stronger vision of what they're trying to do, and they have a higher delivered reality. So in other words, they have live stuff with customers being used as opposed to just roadmap story. So I want to focus on all of those things, and at the end, I've just got a few key takeaways before we go into questions. So I think that's useful just from a summing up perspective. So hopefully all of that makes sense. Let me crack on a little bit and get into some of the data itself. So again, as I said, this comes from our Digital Learning Realities 2025 things. It hasn't yet been published, but it will be very shortly. One of the things we've been asking this over the last 10 plus years, however we've been running it, is, you know, one of the first questions is, what's your top priority for your learning strategy? Trying to sort of track how that's changing. And that has changed a lot over time. I mean, compliance has always been a very big driver for most organizations, and it's been sort of number one for a long period of time. Upskilling and reskilling became a really significant issue, obviously, partly as a consequence of the changes that came around because of the pandemic, but also then changing to the operating model, and then this acceleration of change that we're seeing in business as a whole. So upskilling and reskilling is huge. I've just come back. I've spent 3 days in Paris at an HR conference, and the like skills and things is a massive topic across the whole of the HR space still. And anecdotally, I asked a bunch of people in the presentation I was running to put their hands up, and probably at least 80% of the audience is in some kind of process to build some kind of skills-based organization and so on. So skills are a huge underlying agenda. It's not just within L&D, it's across the wider audience. And AI has now emerged as like, and then almost the next thing, right? So the only thing we are seeing a little bit is around the market and economics. So the financial realities of the market, particularly in Europe, UK and Europe, are impacting the way, you know, budgets and the way things are investing. But generally, you know, these are the topics that are really top of mind. The compliance is still there; it always will be, but it's kind of got relegated down a little bit in terms of the overall priorities. And just to give you a view on that, you know, progressively over the last 3 years, so orange is 2023, 24, 25, obviously into the blue bars, you can see how that change has happened, right? So compliance at number one with 57% into 2023, dropping down, and last year upskilling and reskilling became number one for the first time, and this year that's accelerated even further in terms of that change. So it's just, you know, that you can see where it is, where companies are. And I think focusing on also not just around that, but also around business transformation and change and some of those kind of topics as well. So there's a lot of pressure for L&D to do more. And I think when we look at AI, we've got to look at it within that wider context of not just driving efficiencies and changes the game, which I'll drill into a second, but also transforming what we're doing. And this is possibly where the bigger challenges really lie. We also ask around, you know, how's from a resourcing point of view and budgets and so on, how is this impacting? It's a much more mixed picture around budgets overall, but you can see here some of the trends, and in particular, look at that top line around from resourcing projects, you know, AI to support content creation, 71% increasing thing. So, you know, one of the clear trends we've seen, and we'll talk about it in a second, is that AI is becoming fundamental to elements of the operating model that L&D has, and in particular, obviously, around content, and it's being very disruptive in terms of the potential for content and media creation inside a business, so in-sourced stuff, but also, of course, within your suppliers. So if you use external digital learning companies and things to produce stuff, they're also using this technology to accelerate their ability to produce stuff, and that also is having some impact around costs, right? Cost of content and so on and things like this. So the desire for it. I think the other side of course, this is as this starts to impact more of the L&D function, there's a need to fundamentally upskill L&D itself around the potential that the technology has. And that's obviously a theme that we'll see a little bit more around. But I mean, obviously, particularly around building more expertise, more understanding of AI across the L&D teams as well. So this is just, but these are just high level kind of perspectives at the moment. What I want to kind of really focus on in a little bit more, in obviously more detail, is how is it really? And I think put the word real into a lot of this. We can hypothesize around it, and this is hopefully the biggest takeaway from this, is that what we're trying to do here is really unpeel the onion or whatever it is, and actually understand what's actually going on underneath it, where companies really are at in terms of their adoption. And as I said, we're doing that not just through this trends research that I'm sharing here, but also through lots of roundtables and obviously direct engagement and input that we provide with corporate organizations as well. So let's start with the kind of couple of basic questions. The first one is, how much impact do you think AI is having on your function at L&D at the moment? And again, we've given you 2023, 24, 25 data here. And what you can see is a shift right, effectively, from in the earlier days. And by the way, we've been tracking AI in a learning context for probably the most of the last, at least 8, probably 10 years. So this is not new for us in terms of tracking it. But I think it's post 2022 when we had ChatGPT announced at November 22. Then so into 23 and onwards, this has really exploded as it's become a main topic, not a niche topic, effectively. So in the earlier things, they said a lot of people were already starting to see some impact, but it was more around a little to moderate. And now you can see as it's shifting right, you've got the majority of companies, over 70% now saying moderate or more in terms of starting to do it. I think some of that is a little overstated. I think it feels like that's true, but within certain parts. So things like content generation, I think AI tools have really had a big impact. But when you look at learning administration or other kind of things, I think there are lots of areas where it hasn't really touched much. And I'll come back a bit later on, because when we've done the analysis of AI capability coming out of the vendors, we've got a really good understanding now from a Fosway point of view about where that AI actually is. What are the use cases it's supporting? The other question we've asked, obviously, for the last few years is also, do you think this is overhyped, right? Because there's so much noise around AI. It's hard not to believe that it is overhyped, right? Because it's going to transform everything. Except I think what we're already seeing in terms of our personal lives is it's becoming very widely embedded in lots of things, and actually the potential around it is huge. And actually sometimes understanding how we cope with the change generated by it is really, really important. So 25% people say it's overhyped. I think we've generally seen that the numbers are sort of in this ratio. The numbers of people saying no is actually growing. Maybe is a bit of an answer. So we've got a 50-50 split between no and maybe a /yes. I think what we're seeing progressive over time is generally the trend is towards the no end of the spectrum, but we will see, obviously, as we go forward, we're going to continue to track that. What's driving AI adoption is a whole set of things. And generally, I think it's fair to say, if you look at the top right of this, most of this is around efficiency and productivity. And I think that's something that we really do need to think about then as we go forward, particularly with the need to be more transformational. Optimizing learning production, is a thing. You see the yellow line, flat line. So again, I've given you a view here about the 2024 answers to the 25 answers and how that's changing. The number one being enhancing learning efficiency, number 2 being greater productivity, which has grown quite a lot. But we've also got things around learning effectiveness. And I'll come back and talk about that before, about, can we hyper-personalized learning? Can we create adaptive learning strategies and so on and things like this? So there's lots of different ways in which we think about it. But interesting, there's also optimizing learning delivery. So the actual how we run a lot of the training and learning in organizations is pretty flatlined, right, in terms of that. And then you've got, the bottom end, you've got things around bias and increasing equity and things like this, where it's sort of reduced as a bias, reduced as a driver, because we're so focused, I think, on adoption around productivity, etc. So thinking about where it's then impacting L&D a little bit more. So this is a view around how the learning headcount has changed. And ultimately, you can see it's a very mixed picture. One thing we're generally seeing is companies probably taking a bit more direct ownership of some of the content they would have outsourced, because they now have tools, or they have access to tools that enable them to do that. So content altering, the ability to accelerate content production internally is an area where we're seeing a little bit of growth. Overall, the backdrop here is against probably pressure on L&D headcount generally. So it's kind of hard to draw any real conclusions from that piece. What's very interesting, though, is the right-hand side. The donut chart saying, how is AI going to impact your future resourcing, where you've got 60% saying, a great deal or moderate, a more moderate amount. So none at all is only 10%. So I think one of the things you've got to think about is that this will have an impact, not just on the tools you're using, but the structure of the team and the way that team is kind of deployed, the roles that you have, and obviously the skills that are needed within the team itself. So those are some of the things just to kind of think about. And actually probably the scary bit, maybe, if from an L&D professional point of view, or the opportunity, in the ways you want to look at it, is when we ask people what proportion of the function, and I would probably caveat this quite heavily with a lot of people do not understand yet what the real potential of AI is to transform L&D as a function itself as a whole. But actually, when you ask them what proportion of the work that they do could be replaced by an idea and still be effective, that's really important. I mean, because obviously you can drive change here and deploy technology and actually have a worse outcome, right? So I think we want to still be effective. But what we've got a situation now is with kind of half of the people saying, or more, saying at least 40% of what L&D does, we think probably can be replaced by AI and still be effective. And I think this is a massive challenge for L&D as a function, because if it doesn't grasp that, if it's in denial of it, to some degree, the risk is becoming more superfluous, right? So actually that the business can actually achieve a lot of the things. And that's the whole point, is L&D doesn't have monopoly on these technologies, that the business itself can just engage directly in a lot of this stuff, and it could marginalize what L&D is doing. So it's really, really important to think about this from a potential, in terms of this longer term potential around transformation. It's also really important, obviously, to get the benefits of it in the short term, right? To become more efficient and effective as an organization, and actually be able to deliver more impact for less, which ultimately does very much align with probably what the macro environment is. There's a lot of pressure on L&D to actually deliver more, and particularly, obviously, not just the baseline compliance related activities, but also obviously that more transformational agenda and supporting that future skills agenda within the business, because that is really very significant. And as I said, it's visible not just in L&D, but across the whole C-suite and HR function and C-suite as well. One of the things that I wanted to kind of think around is, like, where is this being applied? So this is kind of interesting, because actually across all our sectors, so learning is probably the number 2 of our 5 segments, where from an AI exposure point of view, the biggest actually is in recruiting, right, which has been has had a lot of AI investment actually prior to November 22 and ChatGPT being announced. So, but when you look at it, at the top, so media creation, media generation is the thing we've talked about. So content, a lot of AI innovation is around content, and I'll come back to this a bit later on. But actually, AI-enabled LMS and LXP is actually the #1 area where companies have been are already using it. So about a third of companies are already using AI embedded in that. A lot of that's around personalized learning recommendations or intelligent search and stuff, and I'll come back around this. Media one is probably the fastest growing because we've got so many organizations also piloting it as well, etc., or looking at it. So that's probably the one with the biggest total spike, but actually the AI powered systems is actually now taking the lead in the thing. So that's actually counter to what a lot of people think. They think a lot of it's actually just coming from content tools. That's not the case. But as you can see, there's a long list here, right? Go further down. Skills and content mapping, curation, performance support, right? So some of these areas are actually very underinvested, probably from an AI point of view. AI-powered assessments. So, I mean, assessment is still one of the most undervalued pieces of the kind of strategic learning mix, and the potential for using AI to auto-generate much more effective assessment, that then enables you to streamline what learning people need to do. You can get best ROI on a piece of learning if you actually don't need to, you can test out of it, so you don't actually need to do it, because then immediately saves you all the time, right? But also then down to things like adaptive learning, and even down into things like operations and planning and so on and things like that. So there's a big wide list of things. Do you think your L&D skilled is adequately skilled in AI around this? No, 52% saying no. What are the future skills that you need? Important for L&D in the future of work and AI being #1 by some fairly significant margin on those, plus a bunch of other ones which I think you kind of see. And I think so this is actually a big driver as well, obviously, for many organizations, is that AI has become almost one of their lead topics for upskilling their organization as well as themselves, and that's actually often the way that there's more activity on it that we see from learning, which is like, how do we enable and upskill the organization around AI rather than how do we upskill ourselves around AI? And that's obviously a bit of a concern as well. So that's something worth to consider. And we've talked a lot about opportunity and what's driving it. We haven't really talked so much about what the problems are. So when you go and say, what challenges are you facing? You can see there's a long list of those. Atop of which is around concerns around corporate IP, data privacy and security, and some of these kind of things. So it's really there's a long list of challenges, and a lot of organizations are still having challenges. I was talking yesterday about some stuff within a wider HR context. This is still the underplayed piece of the story, even though actually we know there's lots of concerns. And I think this is where a lot of organizations are quite challenged, because there's kind of 3 groups here. You've got around policy and security, typically you've got around capability and skill, and then you've got around execution. And I think the challenge then is almost thinking about, what is your strategy for addressing all of these pieces, right? Or what are your strategies? And also from an L&D function perspective, particularly, are you in control of those strategies? Do you influence those strategies? Or are they being defined for you by someone else that has no understanding or things? So typically in most organizations, obviously, IT is defining most of the policy around the top level, and even some of the things around the tools and the choices you have. And even though we kind of, we'll talk about the vendor side in a minute, and how much stuff is coming across from all the vendors, but actually, if your IT function is saying, we are a strategic Microsoft shop, or we use OpenAI or whatever it is, and we're investing in those, there is now contention about whose AI as well is going to be used and what for. In the skills area here, capability and skills is, do you actually understand within the team the potential of what this is available? Can you upskill the scheme around that? How do you acquire those skills and expertise around it? How do you create change within the function? Many of you will have been working like within the digital space within a wider L&D team for some time, and recognize that probably up until COVID, some what you might call leader organizations were obviously have been full bore on engaging with the digital story for a long time. But actually for many, it was only COVID that was the game changer, because suddenly everything had to be digital. So they had to do it. So there is I think, generally L&D can be a bit of a laggard function. It's not leading digital transformation. It's a laggard in digital transformation often. And the risk is the same, could be true for AI as well. At the bottom, in terms of the execution challenges as well, think about some of those. So, we said reducing bias wasn't the driver, but obviously there is a risk of bias and discrimination within the AI models, as well as hallucination and so on and things like that. There are other ethical considerations. There are definitely huge integration challenges. As I said, AI is not owned. Every part of the HR or learning ecosystem that we are looking at, all parts of it are trying to all out their own AI capabilities. But obviously from a corporate strategy point of view, that doesn't work. You have to be able to collectively add all of that up. And then you have to determine whose AI you're using, let alone whether you are, how that fits into the wider corporate strategy beyond L&D and HR. So you've got to think about how all those pieces fit together. Let me move on now and think about, so the sort of second part of the presentation really is trying to focus around understanding what's going on the supply side. So I talked about getting beyond the AI noise. This is about getting beyond the AI vendor noise, I suppose. And as I said, if any of you were in London, which I assume many of you were earlier in the year or in another event, you'll know that suddenly every vendor is now an AI vendor. But obviously, clearly that's not the case, right? For many of them, they're bolting AI on after the event. For some, that they're AI native. They were starting from a whole proposition. They're very new. What is the reality of what's going on in the market, and how much of this is actually real? So one of the things that we did was we kicked off a strategic research project. The first phase of this, which ran during 2025, one of the outputs we've created from this is a sort of supply side assessment. So when you're looking at these documents and the data I'm going to share now, this is very much in terms of the first phase of this around actually understanding the reality of what the vendors are bringing to play. I'm not aware of anybody else publishing any kind of research at this kind of level. So I think if you are interested in it at a fairly granular level, from a corporate point of view, just understanding what is actually going on, because it's really important if you're then going, okay, I want to do these things. Does my vendor support this? Okay, stress testing your vendors and things. One of the things that we found a few people really trying to focus on it. So we published a series of what we called AI market assessments, and we published 3 of those in the summer, one on talent acquisition, and then one on learning systems and another on digital learning. So they're very focused to the segments that we published the 9 grids around. And we've just published, as of about a week ago, something like that, the Cloud HR one. We've got another one coming for talent, which will be coming at probably the end of November. Talent for what we call talent people success. And we're then going around another cycle of this project. So one of the things that if you are a corporate listening to this and you're interested in getting involved and understanding much more deeply what's actually coming along the pipe in terms of from the learning vendors, but also in terms of corporate adoption and value and so on. I've got a slide later on it saying to ask you to get involved. And so we're looking for organizations who want to be part of the phase 2 project, which is just starting now. So we've just started alongside our vendor data capture for the 2026 9 grids. We've just started to go out to the vendors around the next phase of the research in terms of updating it. So what these papers are trying to do is to look at the reality of it. So I'm going to use learning systems because there's so much data in all of this. I can't do it for all of them, but I'm going to use learning systems as an example because obviously it's relevant to this audience. Learning systems is where we look at the LMSs, the LXPs, the specialist solutions around learning experience or administration or whatever it's going to be. Again, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the 9-grid. The functional model that you're seeing in here are that is our functional model for learning. For learning systems. It evolves every year. It's actually evolved slightly this year again in terms of there's a new subsection actually under workplace learning, and there is a underneath all of this, of course, functionally, it's the model evolves all the time, right? So it's been structurally overall it's looked similar, but actually there's a lot of change underneath it. And obviously one of the biggest areas of change is the addition of AI across all of these different areas in terms of understanding where it is. So what we're trying to do is use that functional model to then understand where the AI is being put, where is it built within the thing, and then also understand what the status of it is. So is it if it's in the roadmap, is it in near term, longer term, whatever it's going to be. When we ran this for learning systems in 2025, there were, I think, 70 odd features or something, AI capabilities we were looking at within the learning systems list. We're running that for 26, and in phase 2, there's 120 something. So it's grown hugely. And we also allowed vendors to self-submit additional capabilities that weren't listed in our own AI model for this. And obviously digital learning has its own model, HR has its own model, etc. HR has 182 different capabilities across the cloud HR kind of perspective, the HCM view. So it's huge in terms of the scope of this stuff. And then trying to drill into the reality of it to understand, okay, so you've said this, is this live with customers or not? And where is the AI innovation going? So this is really interesting and enables us to look at it in a number of ways. The first way in which we can look at this is through almost the clustering of AI based on the functional model. So I just showed you the functional model for learning systems. If you look at AI innovation and where is that being clustered, on the left-hand side here, you can see the functional model. And this is what we call an AI flow map. So it's a Sankey diagram, technically, for actually looking at the clustering of different learning, where the AI innovation is going. And you can see that 60% of that is being in the learning experience and learning management tabs, parts of that functional model, the rest on there. The scary bit is not the left-hand side, it's the right-hand side. Okay, so despite all of every vendor being an AI vendor and that almost every vendor roadmap being dominated by AI, when you look at the right-hand side, how much of this is live with customers? Only 10% of the innovations are actually live with customers. And across the vendors as a whole, nearly 70% of them have yet to start on some of those innovations, right? So, the speed with which is changing, even though the volume is huge, actually the reality isn't. It's a long way from being it. And just as a comparison point, that 10% is versus nearly 30% in recruiting, right? So this is a really relatively low score. You can also then see how fast it's coming along. Was it in piloting? Was it being developed in the first half of the year, second half of the year, or 26 and onwards? So we're expecting this to change a lot when we do the next assessment on it. But this is obviously gives you an overall picture on it. And as I said, really, you can see where it's weighted and you can see where it's live. You can then drill into that. So if I drill into it and look at it for, say, learning experience, you can see where it's clustered in learning experience. So search and personalization are the two biggest areas. You can see here it's also a bit more of the learning experience stuff is live with customers. So that's not a massive surprise because obviously things like personalized learning recommendations and things is not a new thing from a learning systems point of view. It's been part of the LX story for actually quite a long time, based on machine learning, not Gen AI, and therefore it's unsurprising. If we look at learning management, you can see that that's clustered largely around learning content, and that's really kind of true across a lot of the AI. There's a huge clustering of AI roadmap on the vendor side that's associated with learning content, whether that's around designing content, building media, and translation of it, and so on, and things like this. There's a lot that's focused on the learning content piece of that. Even within learning systems, if we look at it on digital learning, it's even worse. It's even more clustered around content, etc. as well. Again, slightly higher than the aggregate percentage live around learning content, but yeah, so go back between them. So learning experience is probably leading more. Learning management is really, yes, it's a fairly high, but actually almost all of that, or half of that nearly, is functioned around the content piece rather than, say, formal learning or assessment or something like this, all of which have huge potential for AI as well. The other way of looking at the AI feature set, so as I said, in learning systems, for example, there were 70 odd different AI features we built into the model for the first phase of the cycle. Next phase is 120 odd. The other thing we were really interested in is, okay, so if we look across this, how much of this is live? We've just seen that, but what is what we would consider mainstream or not? So mainstream we defined based on this segmentation model, which we've used across all of our market assessments, is if it's live with more than 50% of the vendors, we considered it to be mainstream, right? So the definition of that mainstream is live with more than 50%. If it's consensus of more than 50%, but live with 25 to 50%, we've called that next wave. So in essence, if it's live with more than half the vendors, that's a mainstream AI feature, right? So it's not differentiating. Most of them will have it already, and if they don't, it's probably most of the rest of them will have it fairly quickly. Next wave is the ones that logically are most likely to be mainstream next time. So these are the ones that are emerging fast. So they've got high vendor consensus, but actually relative, slightly lower percentage of live. But it could be that 48% of them are live. So it's nearly mainstream, but it just isn't quite yet. And then you've got one and very interesting grouping, which we've called Edge Advantage, where Edge Advantage is basically, it's high consensus, but very low percentage. So less than 25% have it actually live. So this is actually very differentiating. So if you're a vendor and you have Edge Advantage features live with customers, you have a competitive advantage because most of your competitors don't have that. And if you're a corporate and you're looking for certain AI capabilities as part of your roadmap, what you're trying to do, the Edge Advantage features are highly differentiating because most of the vendors don't have it live, even though it's actually quite there's quite a high consensus. And then below those, you obviously have mixed consensus, where it's kind of in the middle, and less than 50% have it in their roadmap. And then at the bottom, niche, what we call niche play, is basically, this is something where less than 25% of the vendors even have it in their roadmap. So it's actually quite a niche feature. And for learning systems, there weren't that many of this time. For actually some of the other segments we've looked at, there are a lot of niche play features. And I'm actually expecting that when we do the 26 cycle, we'll see that grow, relatively speaking. Now, that sounds quite a technical definition, but it's actually really useful in trying to understand what's what's really coming along the pipe, just not know in terms of its status, but actually how common this is or not in terms of the vendors, how differentiating it is between the vendors. And if you're trying to stress test vendors, if you want to be working to take AI leadership, clearly you want somebody that's going to have quite a strong performance, particularly against those, not just mainstream and next wave, but probably on the Edge Advantage features as well, because that will probably give you a differentiated position. Just to give you an example, for learning systems, there was only one mainstream feature, right? So of all of this stuff and all of the noise, there was only one mainstream feature out of the 70 odd that we're mapping. There were 23 next wave. So these are ones with the potential to be live soon. And then there are another 28 in Edge Advantage with about a third below that are kind of in there. We've just done, as I said, just published Cloud HR. Out of about 182, there were 2 mainstream features that are live with the more than 50% of the vendors. It just shows you how much of this is really still roadmap and hype rather than reality, right? If less than 50% of the vendors don't have it live. So it clearly cannot be mainstream in that sense. for those interested, what was the mainstream AI feature that was the only one that's live? Personalized learning recommendations. So again, from a learning systems point of view, I'm sure that's not a surprise to anybody. The most common focus has been around, I log into a system, I see that based on maybe my role or skills or whatever, the system makes that personalized set of recommendations. It doesn't just say, go and search everything. It's making those recommendations for me. That is fairly common, if you like, to the learning systems evolution story and the LXP story, particularly over the last 5-10 years, right? So it's not a massive surprise. What is a surprise is the only one that was actually a mainstream and live with more than 50% of the vendors. When you look at what's next wave, so I've simplified it here. I'll show you the next chart, how we actually presented it in the market assessment papers. When you look at the market assessment papers, they will actually give you the percentage consensus and the percentage live as well. But I've tried to simplify it just to make it easier to see. So generative, Gen AI content creation, auto tagging of content for skills, using AI to generate questions, etc., and so on. These are all things where you're starting to see. We're starting to see some things around adaptive learning, but actually a lot of the adaptive learning is actually part of the edge advantage type stuff. It's really not quite there yet. But these are the things that are actually in that kind of next wave thing. So these are the ones that are, some of these are very close to being mainstream, others are less so. And just to give you an example, at a more granular level, this is actually the kind of top list from Edge Advantage. And you can see on the right-hand side, what we're actually showing here is the vendor consensus as also the percentage live. So this is where we start talking natural language technology around, chatbots, adaptive learning, AI as a study buddy, virtual tutor support, again, something else around adaptive learning and so on. There's quite a lot of, and this is only a subset of the list, right? There's a lot more in there. But you can see, even say with these Edge Advantage features, you've got, the top one where it's in 84% of the vendor roadmaps and live with 23%. So that means it's almost next wave versus something like AI AI Study Buddy, for example, which is about halfway down, which has got nearly 70%, 68% have got it in there as a consensus, but only 2% have it live. So if you're looking for that type of capability, very few of the vendors actually have that live. So it's very discriminating in terms of what you're looking at going on. So this is it's a very kind of robust way of looking at it. As I said, we've looked at both where it's allocated and also how it's, how mainstream, how common it is or not. The final piece, of course, is assessing the vendors themselves, right? So we can look at it on the vendor side. I'm not going to kind of show you specifics where vendors rack or thing because it's too complicated, but you can see on this chart, this is a view of AI roadmap versus AI reality. So how much is live? And you can see here a huge distribution of it. And it's quite interesting when you look at this across our different segments where the clustering is. So here we have a few vendors on the top right where they've got very significant roadmap, but they've also got a lot of live delivery. These means obviously they, at the moment, from an AI perspective, these companies will have a competitive advantage around it. You've got quite a lot of custard in the mid-left side, which means there's quite a lot of roadmap, but there's less reality. And obviously you have some down in the bottom left-hand side. If I showed you that for cloud HR, you would see a few people on the right and almost everybody in the bottom left. So in other words, lots of not many of them actually have a very extensive roadmap by overall standards and so on and things like this. So this is like, and the question is, where is your vendor, right? If you're working with strategic vendors, this is for learning systems, but you can look at it for digital learning, you can look at it for talent acquisition, wherever it is. Where are your vendors in this? Where are they at with their roadmap? We can also look at this by so again, this is a real sample vendor, but we've just anonymized them. So on this, the green is what we call market best. So this is the best that anybody scores on in terms of their AI capability around those different 5 main pillars. And then the orange line is where the actual vendor was in terms of their capability, and the blue underlying thing is what we've called market average. So what's the average across all of the vendors? So you can see in this case, this particular vendor has a slight edge on learning experience and on people development, but is below market average on all the other three areas. And that's actually a real vendor that we're looking at there as well. So we've got that kind of mapping for everybody, all the vendors. So again, this is something that potentially, if you're interested in, or you're making decisions around future supply options, you want to understand what their AI is, obviously, please come and engage with us around this, because we have a real kind of a view around it. And this can also we can also look at a specific vendor. So this is one of the leader vendors in learning systems. You can see, how much of the live, how much they have live with those different feature sets, mainstream, next wave, edge advantage, etc., and stuff like that as well. So we can do a very granular view just from an AI perspective, on top of what we can actually also do, of course, from a functional perspective, when we're looking at things like for the 9-grid process and so on, about where a vendor really plays and performs. So overall, you're seeing that from multiple angles. You can see it from the, where is AI being invested within these topics? Where is the roadmap reality or not? Where is what's the feature segmentation? Then ultimately, where do the vendors perform? So hopefully that kind of all makes sense. As I said, it's very much a work in progress on research, and definitely something that if you're interested in really understanding more around AI, please come and talk to us and engage more in that. Just a couple of key takeaways, right? So overall, what's the conclusions from all of this? So first one is, and this possibly sounds a bit trite, but take AI seriously. It is going to seriously impact your L&D function. You can't really be in denial around this. It will impact strategy, it will impact resourcing, it will impact priorities and the rest of things as well. So I think stepping up to that is really important. Focus also, but though focus what's real, right? I think the risk is that we get sucked into the whole hype scenario. What we're seeing is most organizations generally focusing around certain use cases and specific for specific things that they're trying to make successful, and then rolling those out rather than just wholesale AI adoption across everything. Few features are mainstream. That's true across all of the segments that we're looking at, but the speed of change is really significant. Next wave is already upon us, and I think when we do our 26 assessment, phase 2 assessment for AI, that we'll already see the number of mainstream features increase. Think about those challenge areas. I talked about those 3 challenge areas around policy, security, capability, skills, and execution. I think all of those are things that you need to have a clear and conscious strategy around, and that strategy is not an L&D only one. It has to be connected to the wider HR function, and of course into to corporate strategy as well. But all of those 3 areas need a kind of serious approach to them. I think from an AI adoption point of view, in terms of the use cases and value, focus on the things where you have clear priorities and business goals. It's easy to play with stuff on something that doesn't matter and actually is pretty marginal. So that sounds like it's a low risk, but it's also incredibly low value. You've got to think about how you actually do things that matter, not just to L&D, but to the business as well, right? What adds real value? Upskill the L&D team. This is, can't emphasize enough how much you need to understand what's coming along at you, but also how you're going to get value and adopt it. And ultimately, of course, from us, you're running this with suppliers and so on, stress test them, understand what capabilities they've got, where they are on that roadmap, because ultimately, if your partners can't support you in that transition, they may be slowing you down. So hopefully those are kind of clear. As I said, we're about to start on the phase 2 process around this, drilling into all of these. In particular, we're really also focusing around adoption and value. So it's not just in terms of updating all that research and running all the kind of corporate side strategy kind of bit. We also really want to understand who's using this stuff and getting value from it and what that value is as well. So there's a huge opportunity if you want to get involved to actually kind of drill into that and understand that more. Hopefully that's given you a lot to think about. And we've got maybe a few minutes for questions. Sarah?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, David. Wow, so much to take in there. We've had some brilliant questions in the chat, so I'm just going to share some of them with, we've got 10 minutes, haven't we? So Caroline has asked, I have the impression that most L&D teams are learning by themselves on how to use AI and how it could help them. So which tools would be best for them? Have any thought on that, David? Which tools would be best to help them?
So I think that, so a couple of comments then. First of all, I mean, there's lots of resources out there and lots of people trying to upskill your L&, to be a partner to help you upskill the team. Generally, I think we're finding, if it's evidence from our roundtables, when we've run lots of roundtables, there's a huge willingness from learning leaders to get involved in those things, to understand what everybody else is doing, and it's almost with a sense of relief when they find out that others aren't doing that much either. Yeah. Right. So I think it is important to be out there and engaging in these things. Obviously, I'm sure there's lots of the for example, the presentations in the Autumn Forum have been around AI. It's almost impossible to ignore it as a topic. But I just think so much of it is driven by not a lot of this is mature referenced case study stuff yet, right? It's still very early stages.
Yeah.
Also, most of the things like, institutes, LPI and other things like this are also trying to create programs, I think, for their members to engage in a topic, and maybe even basically sort of training kind of effectively things and things like that. So I think the reality, I think that my first point almost is, do not ignore this, right? Take it seriously and engage in it. And I think a lot of that would be externally. Just listening to presentations, whether it's mine or anybody else's, is not enough. You have to engage more actively in it. And then almost things like, as I said, purposefully look for reasons to accelerate or change what you're doing, almost rather than assuming that this might be relevant, but I have to be very careful around it. I think you need to purposefully play, but do that on things around priorities that matter rather than priorities that don't. I think the danger is people pick ideas and things for pilots for things that are not really that significant. And the danger is that you're going to, because of the rate of change here is quite high, the rate of change even within the AI, you've seen the stories about the different generations, for example, of ChatGPT and so on, and coming along and things, let alone obviously of what's being put in the tool. So I don't think they're learning on their own. I think people are eager to understand what else is coming on. Although I'm not sure that's systemic within a function. I think it's still individuals.
Any particular tools that come to mind to mention?
No, not really. I mean, I think it's the wrong question, right? I just think you need to look at thinking about what tools is like saying, I just think about, well, what's my problem? What am I trying to do? What is my strategy? Where is this going to? I think we just got to think about it much bigger than that.
It's knowing what's out there, isn't it? And then absolutely thinking about, well, what's relevant. Otherwise, you could be doing a lot with a lot of things. Okay, let's go on.
Every part of your tool set that you're using to support any aspect of learning management, content creation, delivery, scheduling, skills, wider people development function, everything has got AI coming down the pipe at it. There's not one part of that there are bits which are underinvested. I didn't talk about some of those things, but when you look at the functional model, you can see other areas are neglected, so they are relatively underinvested. But they will not escape, right? It's coming across everywhere. And it's not about playing around with the content, a media generation tool, think, oh, this is really interesting. If that's all you're doing, you're missing the point.
Okay. Conscious of time, David, just there's a note there from Andrew that's good. It's important to go back to the tools that you've tried and not made work. and see what you can improve on. Okay, let's jump to the next one. I'm conscious of time. We've just got a few minutes left. Jane asked, could you please share the industries and population you targeted for the survey? Interested to know the makeup of the respondents.
So it's typically enterprise organizations headquartered in UK and EMEA. So that's effectively of it. I can't remember the date of things offhand, but normally 60-70% of those will be more than 5,000 employee organizations. So they're typically, our focus is on mid and large enterprise organizations, although enterprise now is a much wider set of companies, but more than 1,000 employees, and we mainly focus on private sector businesses. So, but there will be people from government or another thing, organizations inputting into some of that research as well.
Great.
But EMEA focus, that's an important point, right? This is not US companies talking about stuff that's going on in the US. This is about what's going on in UK and Europe. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. Hope that's answered your question, Jane. So next, Sebastian's asked which AI, LMS and LXPs are the most used systems, do you know? And also for AI translation, any thought on that?
So AI for translation is one of the high adopter areas. It didn't make mainstream, but it's in digital learning, for example, it's like one of the nearly mainstream features, whatever. I think that's fairly common. I mean, most translation agencies are a tough business to be in, isn't it, over the last couple of years or so with AI coming along. So AI for translation and content translation is a very high area of interest or of activity. And again, it's an area where a lot of different parts are building automatically in their model. So auto translation and things like this. And that's obviously the costs associated with that, if you were in doing multi-language content creation, was huge, right, before. So a lot of people getting around that. So that's a huge area of adoptions. From an LMS and LXP perspective, most used is kind of an interesting question in terms of what does that mean from a tools point of view. The most used tools are the ones that are most deployed, right? So the biggest vendors in the market are the cornerstones of this world, the Docebos of this world, the HCM vendors, right? So on the large enterprise piece of the market, that's the biggest competition, is probably Cornerstone versus Workday and SAP. So and again, Workday and SAP have got extensive AI roadmaps as part of their wider HCM suite, but also in learning as well. So Degreed and other those kind of places. So in some ways, again, it's a wrong. What's the wrong question? Most used, is that really the most important thing that we need to know? Who is an AI leader is a different question. And obviously, we're trying to assess that quite closely. But you can't. It's not just a straightforward thing. For example, Workday acquired Sana recently, and that is that's an AI first platform, right? That's one of the ones that's been building, very much an AI first. Before the AI, everybody else was doing the AI stuff as well.
Well, thank you for that, David. Hopefully that's given you some context there and some thought there, Sebastian. So maybe time for one more. Amanda, we've got a couple more, but maybe I encourage you to reach out to David, right, in the Fosway Group and follow up with any of those questions. But maybe time for just one more. Amanda's asked, said, is L&D a laggard in adoption? Because often budgets in L&D are tighter, right, than in other parts of the business. So the decisions to have to be good to justify the spend. It's not just easy to invest in something and try and see an L&D like it could be in other technical R&D functions. I guess she's just asking your thought on that. What's your response to that?
So I think it does vary a lot from organization to organizations. Many companies like L&D is a laggard function anyway. It was around digital, and it probably will be around AI. It's not alone. Finance and HR are generally not much better. If in some cases are a lot worse. So from that perspective, I think it's around discretionary budget to go and play with stuff is, again, thinking about it in the wrong way, really. Just because at the end of the day, pretty much any tools and platforms you're using are going to have AI coming down the pipe at them, as I said, if not already live capability. So I think it's really around having a more assertive agenda for thinking about how you're going to adopt and upskill their IT, your team around what is capable of happening. So, and in some cases, definitely L&D is an AI leader in companies, but that's actually it is unfortunately a bit more of a rarity.
Yeah, it's a good point. Okay, we've come to time. Is there anything else you wanted to share, David, before we jump off? Just like a couple
Yeah,
of
just literally a couple of close slides, because if people are interested in the research, I provided a link earlier. Here's the link again around that AI market research that we had, but also go and look at our knowledge center, the 9 grids, etc. All of these are obviously also talking about touching on AI as well. So these are the kind of main links from them. As I said, if anybody wants the slides, let us know. We can have them afterwards. Also, again, from a corporate perspective, we have a membership thing. So if you want access to some of that research at a deeper level or want support or input around it, you can do that as well. That's all I had really to add.
Thank you. Well, we've had some great comments in the chat. Thank you so much for everyone being so interactive. Some great questions, some brilliant feedback, David. So thank you so much for your time. Just as a final point as you leave, next session, 11:30, guys. So relationships and results, how mentorship can drive business performance. So do tap into that one. And thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for your time, David, and sharing your insights.
Thanks, everybody.